Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be going through the discography of Fiona Apple, who is, in my opinion, one of the best and most unique female singer-songwriters to come out of the 90s. Between her amazing musicianship as a vocalist and a piano player, and her incredibly unique and unpredictable songwriting style, and her amazing ability to write music that has a lot of intricacies to it, and is very artistic and complex, but is also presented in a way that can be palatable to the average music listener, and I think that's a very difficult balance to achieve, and I think she is one artist that is a perfect example of doing that. And for how long she's been around up to this point, she hasn't released a ton of music, but she has put out a handful of albums that are so interesting and have so much depth to them, and because of that, I almost feel like she's the type of artist that doesn't need to release a ton of music, because what she's given us so far has so much stuff to explore and continue to go back to, and every time I go back and listen to one of her albums, I always notice something new that I didn't pick up on the previous listen. And throughout her 5-album discography, she has continued to give us music that is completely authentic to who she is, and she always goes to the beat of her own drum and never tries to write stuff based on pressures from pleasing a certain audience demographic or pleasing a record label. She's always done stuff that is completely authentic to herself, and I think that is one of the reasons why her music is so unique and why so many people love her as much as they do. So I'm very happy to be covering her for today's episode, and what I'm going to do is go through her 5 studio albums, starting with Title and going up to Fetch the Bolt Cutters, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have her debut studio album from 1996, which is called Title, and I will give this one a B. It was a hard decision to put this one in B tier, but if I'm going through her 5 albums, I would say that this one would be my least favorite, but it is not a bad album by any stretch, and my main reasoning for putting it in B tier is really just because of how I view it in comparison to her other 4 albums. So going by Fiona Apple standards, I would give this a B, but regardless of that, this is still certainly a very good record and a nice debut album to put out. It contains 10 songs, and stylistically the songs are very piano-centered, with some being more stripped down and others having more drums and percussion. And instrumentally, we have a lot of beautiful and lush additions to the sound, with vibraphone, harp, marimba, a string section, and pedal steel guitars going into that orchestral pop and baroque pop territory. Contributing a lot with some of these instruments is John Bryan, who is a legendary songwriter and producer and one of my all-time favorite musicians, and I love that he contributed on this release as well as the 2 albums that would follow it. I think anytime John Bryan is involved in something, it is definitely going to be great. And largely, I think that this album is really good and consistent. I wouldn't say there are any songs on here that I dislike. I just think more from a stylistic perspective, I do think that this is probably her least adventurous album, and that's not necessarily a bad thing depending on what mood you're looking for. And even though there are still plenty of elements of surprise throughout this, I do think that the songwriting and stylistic choices throughout it do lack some of those surprising and more experimental elements that we would get in the albums that would follow it. I also think that because this album features a large amount of songs that are ballads or in a slower tempo, sometimes for me the energy can feel like it needs a little bit of a pick-me-up at certain points. I would say about half of this album is on the slower side, with tracks like Sullen Girl, Slow Like Honey, Never Is a Promise, The Child Is Gone, and Pale September. And none of these are bad tracks, and some are very beautiful, and the instrumentation really adds to these songs and makes them shine even brighter. But I personally would have preferred a couple of more higher energy songs to sort of balance them out a bit more, but that's just a stylistic preference on my part. Regardless though, this album still contains all of those elements that I love about Fiona Apple's writing, with her lush instrumentation, beautiful sense of melody, and her unorthodox and adventurous sense of chord movements. And it still has a nice handful of great tracks, with 3 of the songs on here being singles, and also spawning one of her most popular songs ever, which is Criminal. For me personally, my 3 favorite songs on here would be The First Taste, Pale September, and Slow Like Honey, and the only song that would probably make my top 10 favorite Fiona Apple song list on here would be The First Taste. I really love that track, and I think it has such a cool groove. But yeah, my main critiques of this album, like I said, I think the energy can be a little slow throughout. It can feel a little draggy because of how many slower tempo tracks there are. And it's her first album. She was very young when this was released. I believe she was 18. So I do think that the songwriting does continue to get more and more mature as the records continue. Even though this is by no means an immature record for an 18-year-old, this is some really solid and high-quality music for her to be putting out at that young of an age. But I do think that the songwriting will continue to enhance more and more as the albums go on. But regardless of that, it is still a very good album. Even though it's my least favorite Fiona Apple album, it's still a very quality first release to put out there, and it's only going to go up from here. So a good debut album. This one gets a B. Okay, next we have her second studio album from 1999, which has an incredibly long title. At the time that this was released, this actually broke a record for the longest album title, but I will do the abridged version, which is When the Pawn, and this one easily gets an S. An absolutely incredible album, and when we are talking about female singer-songwriter albums that came out in the 90s, this one very well might be my favorite of that entire decade. There's one other album that I'm always kind of torn between. It's always between this and Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette. Two albums that are very different, but I would say that they are masterpieces and my favorite female singer-songwriter albums to come out of the 90s. I think this was such a massive upgrade from Tidal, and by every metric, I think everything got better, with the songwriting venturing out into more adventurous stylistic territories, with the experimentation and art rock, as well as some jazz touches being introduced, her sense of harmony and melody getting more adventurous, and an absolutely incredible job on the production side from John Bryan. This album is just filled with so many little subtle layers and textures and intricacies and beautiful instrumental pairings. And like I said, anytime John Bryan is involved with a project, you are going to get the best. And I think the production on this is about as clear of an example of that as you can get. I also like the general vibe of this album more than Tidal. This one gets a bit darker at times and also has a lot more aggression and attitude to it, which I think really enhances it. Similar to Tidal, this one has 10 tracks, and I think every single song on here is amazing. That feeling of attitude and aggression comes in right out of the gate with track 1, On the Bound, an absolute banger of an opener with these dark and ominous piano chords and a hard-hitting groove and vocal performance. Definitely one of my favorites on here, and easily my favorite opening track of any Fiona Apple record. Then that is followed up beautifully with the clever and groovy track To Your Love, another relationship and romance-centered song, which is a common theme within a lot of these songs, and in general throughout the Fiona Apple discography, that's a subject matter that gets covered a lot, and I think this track does a really great job of contrasting the more aggressive opening song, but still maintaining that attitude that is sort of at the core of all of these songs. Then we go into Limp, which is another amazing track on here, and this was actually the first Fiona Apple song that I ever heard, which is kind of a random first track, but I was very intrigued by the sound of it, and it was the song that made me want to go and explore the rest of her stuff. I really love the difference in the mood and dynamics of the two sections, with the opening section being a little more mysterious and darker, and then the chorus getting a little bit groovier and more percussive, and the dynamics coming up. Really cool song. Then we go into Love Ridden, which is the first ballad of the album, and one that stylistically sounds like something that could have been on Tidal, but I think the songwriting on here is far superior to that. I love the vocal melodies, the harmonic movements in the piano, and the string arrangements just add such a nice additional texture. A perfect spot to place a ballad after the opening 3 tracks, which had more energy. And then we have Paper Bag, which is probably the most popular song from this album, and another Fiona Apple classic that I absolutely love. Then we go into A Mistake, an awesome song to vibe out to, and in my opinion, one of the tracks where you really hear John Bryan shine with his production, as well as his instrumental performances with the very cool keyboard sounds, as well as the very interesting guitar background parts. Then we change gears with Fast As You Can, another favorite of mine on here. It's such a badass groove and great feel changes that happen throughout it. A perfect pick-me-up track to set up the final 3 songs of the album, which starts with The Way Things Are, which is a mid-tempo track with a chill vibe to it. I've always particularly loved the chorus of this track. I think that vocal melody is very colorful and super catchy. Then we have Get Gone, which is a song that takes us through all sorts of different feels, starting out as a piano-centered ballad with brushes in the drums, and eventually building into a hard-hitting chorus, another song with great contrasting sections, and after that, the album concludes with I Know, wrapping up the album on a piano-centered ballad with a string section on top of it, a very pretty and tasteful way to wrap up this incredible album, and I like how much it contrasts the mood and high energy of the opening track. So from track 1 to track 10, I don't think she wastes a moment. All of the songs on here are great on every front, musically, lyrically, production-wise, stylistically, and compositionally. Just a massive improvement upon her first release, and I think the blend of ballads to higher energy tracks makes for a much more consistent album and much more interesting from front to back, and just everything about this album I think is incredible. And like I said, one of the, if not the best, female singer-songwriter album of the 90s, hands down. So an absolutely incredible album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have her third studio album from 2005 titled Extraordinary Machine, and I will give this one an A. A very good album. I would say it's a slight downgrade from When the Pawn, but I do like it more than Title as well. I think the songwriting is much more interesting throughout this compared to Title. It's got 12 songs, and I think she does a really great job of stretching out her sound from a stylistic standpoint, but also on certain tracks doing a great job of picking up from where she left off on When the Pawn. It opens up with the title track, Extraordinary Machine, which is a beautiful and fun opening track with this orchestral, jazzy sort of feel. So many pretty instrumental textures and layers all throughout this, and a very different opener from When the Pawn, which I think does a great job of showing the listener that this album is going to go into some different directions from what we heard prior. Then we bring the energy up with Get Him Back, a very badass and groovy song with really cool piano parts. I'm going to do a little bit of music theory here, but there are a lot of tritones in the bass notes on this track, which create this feeling of uneasiness that I love so much. A song that perfectly encapsulates Fiona Apple's amazing ability to take tense and dissonant sounding harmonic movements and make them really groovy. And the same thing can actually be heard on the follow-up track, Oh Sailor. That one has some minor seconds in the piano part, which is a very dissonant interval for most music listeners. And again, a perfect example of utilizing these interesting and unorthodox sounds in such a unique and effective way. After that, we have Better Version of Me, which is one of a couple of tracks on here that I've never been crazy about. For whatever reason, I've never found anything about this song particularly exciting. But after that, we have one of my favorite tracks on here titled Timps, the Sick in the Head song. I absolutely love the groove to the opening section. To me, it almost sounds like it could be a beat to like an early Eminem song. And then the change in mood and vibe between the two main sections is so cool. I love the heavy instrumental interlude too. It's so badass and hard-hitting when it comes in. Then we have our first piano ballad titled Parting Gift, and I've really never been crazy about this song either. I think in the grand scheme of Fiona Apple ballads, this one isn't particularly memorable compared to a lot of her others. And then we bring the energy up with Window, a feel-good song with some cool percussion sounds. Not one of my favorite tracks on here, but not a skip over for me either. Then we have another favorite of mine on here titled Oh Well, another one with such unique chord progressions going on in the piano. The second and third chord in particular are so dark and dissonant, and even the second section of the song starts out on a really tense chord voicing, and I think those unique chord movements are a trait that is especially prevalent throughout this album, and I think for me personally, being a musician who is interested in stuff like that, I would say that that is one of the big reasons why I do enjoy so much of this album, and would put it above Title, even though this album does have more skip-over tracks for me compared to Title, but I think musically it's just so much more interesting and unorthodox, and is definitely my main reasoning for liking it more. After that, we go into Please, 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 which is the perfect poppier track. This one has always given me hints of John Bryan. It sounds like a song that he would write, and I've always wondered if John was a big influence on Fiona's songwriting, because a lot of the melodies and harmonic movements that she uses have some of those classic John Bryan feels, in my opinion. After that, we have a very nicely placed ballad titled Red, 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 which sets up the final two songs great, starting out with Not About Love, a very cool song with intricate grooves and colorful arpeggiated piano parts, and another one that has some very dark and dissonant chord voicings throughout it. A great high energy song to set up the final track, which is Waltz Better Than Fine, another piano ballad, which wraps up the album similar to how When the Pawn concludes. The only difference being that this one does pick up in energy for the final minute and a half with some very pretty and unique instrumentations, a solid closer to a very solid album. So as you can see, I do really like about 85 to 90% of this album. It does have a track or two that I'm not crazy about, and I do think that if it was condensed down to maybe 10 or 11 songs, it would have been even better. But in the midst of that, it does have a handful of songs I love and a couple that would definitely be contenders for my top 10 favorite Fiona Apple song list. And like I had mentioned, I think her sense of harmony is even further expanded on this one and going into a lot of uncharted territories with so many dissonant chord voicings and unorthodox harmonic movements that are just very unique for a traditional pop and rock music style. And I absolutely love stuff like that, and that is one of the main reasons why I like this album as much as I do. So a great album. This one gets an A. All right, next we have her fourth studio album from 2012, another one with a very long title, but I will just say the abridged title, which is The Idler Wheel, and I will give this one an S. An absolutely amazing album, and in my opinion, an upgrade from Extraordinary Machine. I really love what she did stylistically on this. In my opinion, this is art pop at about as high of a level as you can get. A lot of these tracks pick up from where they left off on Extraordinary Machine, but I would say they even veer into some more unorthodox and experimental territories from a melodic and harmonic perspective. And she's taking some more liberties with the styles from song to song, similar to the previous album. Like I had mentioned, we have a lot of unorthodox and dissonant chord voicings and harmonic movements, some of Fiona's most beautiful and catchy vocal melodies of any of her albums in my opinion. The piano parts are also a little bit more choppy and technical at times, with some very intricate single note piano parts, and also the instrumentation is a little bit more subtle, but at the same time there is still some experimentation happening within that subtlety with different instrumentations and different types of samples being used. Another thing I will say is, of all of the Fiona Apple albums, this one actually has the largest amount of my favorite Fiona Apple songs, so that's another very big thing in favor of this record. It's got 10 songs opening up with Every Single Night, which is a very pretty and tasteful opener. I've always felt like the instrumentation of this song makes it sound like a lullaby, which I like a lot, and I think it creates a very tender and inviting sort of mood for the start of the album, and it really makes you wonder where it's going to go next. And then the album just continues to deliver with one amazing track after the next. A lot of the songs on here are using minimal amounts of the drum set and instead have more percussive things going on with a wide variety of experimental sorts of sounds, which is actually a precursor to something that she's going to explore even more on her next album. We have some very beautiful ballads like Valentine, Werewolf, and Regret. We have a couple of songs that have a lot of tension and dissonance at the core of them, with tracks like Jonathan and Left Alone, and a couple of tracks that venture into some more upbeat territories at times, with tracks like Periphery and Anything We Want. And the closing track, Hot Knife, is a layered vocal-centered track that has such a great energy to it, with really cool staggered harmonies layered on top of it. And another song that I think gives us a taste of what direction she was going to go into for her next album, Fetch the Bolt Cutters. And I hadn't initially realized that when I first heard this album, but after going back and re-listening to it, I do think that it had a little bit more in common with Fetch the Bolt Cutters than I had originally thought that it did. Obviously, they are still very different from one another, but I do think there are little hints of some areas that she was going to explore even more on that album, like I said, with the experimental percussion and the closing track, Hot Knife. And like I said, this album contains the largest amount of my favorite Fiona Apple songs. My top 4 favorites on here are Werewolf, Valentine, Jonathan, and Anything We Want. Werewolf is probably my favorite Fiona Apple song. Everything about that song is perfect. The piano parts, the vocal melodies, her lyrics, just a perfect piano ballad that really pulls at your heartstrings. The only critique that I will give this album is that it does have 2 tracks I've never been super crazy about, with Daredevil and Periphery. I wouldn't say that they are bad songs, but I think compared to all of the other incredible tracks on here, I do think that these 2 songs kind of stand out the least. And I think that that is my only light critique I can give of this album. And comparing this to When the Pawn and saying which one I like more than the other, my general feeling of the two albums is that I think When the Pawn is more consistent from front to back and doesn't have any songs that I dislike. But I think from an individual track standpoint, this album has more standout tracks for me personally, and like I said, has the largest amount of my favorite Fiona Apple songs. But I think because of the consistency factor, I would have to say that When the Pawn is a little bit better, but this album absolutely gives it a run for its money, and I would go even as far as to say that this is one of the best female singer-songwriter albums of the 2010s. So an absolutely amazing album with so many exceptional and unique tracks. This one gets an easy S. All right, and last but not least, we have her fifth and most recent studio album from 2020 titled Fetch the Bolt Cutters. And I'm going to give this one an A. A very good album, and it's always interesting seeing where people rank this one in her discography because I feel like this is probably the album that people are most divided on. Some people regard it as her best release, others will say that it's her worst, and then there's people that are somewhere in the middle, and I feel like I've always kind of been in the middle with this one. I do think that it is very good, but in comparison to When the Pawn and The Idler Wheel, I do think that those are stronger, but this is still certainly a great album. After The Idler Wheel, there was an 8-year gap between these two records, so I was very curious to see where she was going to go stylistically, and yet again, she took the music into places that I was not anticipating, with a lot of experimentation going on from a songwriting and instrumental perspective, a lot more unorthodox percussion sounds, uses of unorthodox instruments like the auto harp and mellotron, experimental vocal sounds, more unpredictable instrumental sections in the songs, and a wide variety of different stylistic choices from track to track. This album was mostly recorded at Fiona's home in Venice Beach on GarageBand over the course of many years, and I think the fact that this album was recorded on GarageBand alone makes it an amazing accomplishment and really shows you the types of amazing sounds and capabilities that can be achieved on GarageBand. The album is 13 tracks long, and for me personally, I think the strongest part of this album is the opening 5 songs. To me, that's really where the momentum and quality of each track is the highest. I Want You to Love Me opens up the album beautifully with this lush piano part and beautiful vocal melodies, a perfect opener that sounds like a more experimental version of a track that could have been on When the Pawn. And then the follow-up track, Shamika, is in a similar realm, a really nice high-energy track with the single-note triplet lines in the piano, and this song goes in and out of all sorts of detours and feel changes and makes for a very adventurous listen. Then we have the title track, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, which really explores different types of percussion sounds and interesting instrumental pairings. I would say this is the most experimental song up to this point and would definitely be one of my favorite tracks on here. Then we go into Under the Table, another incredible and unique song. I love the fast-paced vocal parts. I think they contrast the more stripped-down instrumentation very nicely, and I feel like once it gets to this point in the album, most of the remaining tracks veer off into a lot of different territories with more unorthodox percussion parts, more colorful and exotic harmonies in the keyboards, and there are a handful of tracks that are much more centered on the vocals and percussion, with some of them having very minimal instrumentation, with tracks like Relay, Newspaper, For Her, and Drum Set. And I do like the fact that from song to song, you really have no idea what to expect, but once we get to track 6 and onward, I wouldn't say that I love every single song for the remainder of this album. There are a couple of songs that I don't resonate with as much as some of her other tracks, but there are still some very enjoyable moments throughout the rest of the album, with a couple of my favorites being Ladies, Cosmonauts, and For Her. So it is a very good album, but I wouldn't say that every single song on here is a home run, but there are certainly a lot of gems throughout it, and definitely has at least 2 to 3 songs that would be contenders for my top 10 favorite Fiona Apple song list. And with an album as different and as experimental as this, it makes me wonder where she could possibly go next if she decides to make a 6th album. And I greatly appreciate the fact that at this point in her discography, she is still taking more chances than ever, and I think that whenever you do that, it can be risky because because it can result in putting out some stuff that not everybody will resonate with, but on the flip side of that, the payoffs are huge with the good songs that do come out of that. So a very good album, not my number one favorite of hers, but for where she is at this point in her career and her discography, I think this is a very unique and very solid album. So this one will get an A. All right, we did it. We went through her 5 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. Like I said at the beginning of the video, for someone who has been around as long as she has, she doesn't have a ton of music out in the world, but whenever she decides to release something, you can always guarantee that it is going to be fresh, authentic, and consist of music that is truly what Fiona was feeling and wanting to write about at that time, and nothing that is being created out of pressure to fit into some sort of image of how she thinks people view her. And I think that is the main characteristic of Fiona Apple that resonates with so many people, and why she is, in my opinion, one of the most unique female singer-songwriters, not only to come out of the 90s, but I would say of all time. And all 5 of her albums have so much depth to them, with so much intricate writing and little subtleties sprinkled throughout every single track. And like I said, because of that, I don't think it is a huge deal that she's only released 5 albums, because these albums can be listened back to dozens and dozens of times, and you will still pick up on new things that you hadn't heard before. And another reason why she is just such an amazing artist. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the descriptions, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, I think that's about it. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.